pessimism about his economic policies. But he also says he's sure they'll eventually see the error of their opinions. An important Reagan-Brezhnev exchange on a nuclear weapons freeze, and there's a growing concern that the crises in both Central America and the Middle East are worsening. Hugh, President Reagan seems to have arrived about the point that all presidents eventually arrive in regard to the media. He thinks we're unfair. You agree?
I think, Martin, the press is correct in its perceptions, but I think it is indeed, in some instances, very unfair in the pursuit of those perceptions.
George?
Well, the president's right that economics is increasingly a branch of social psychology, and animal spirits and optimism and confidence and all that matter, and press reporting doesn't help, but the fact that the problems are out there to be reported is the problem.
Jack?
Martin, yes, I think especially the television networks, but to a lesser extent the print media also, have been quite unfair to the president in their coverage of his economic program. I'll cite some instances when I have a chance.
I think the basic fault of the press may be that it took it a year to get around to figuring out what was happening in this country and then going about telling the American people the truth.
Too tardy, not unfair.
That's correct.
Well, we'll look for documentation of these observations in a minute. When you were running, you indicate the president was right, to some extent, went a bit too far. What do you mean?
Martin, let me give an illustration. I went out to the Middle West here just a few days ago and stayed there a few days. And in my normal pursuit in Washington, I don't listen to that much television. But out there with people, I listen morning, noon, and night. I listen to the radio, public radio, commercial radio. And whereas I could agree with probably 80% of the positions that were taken, those interviewed on the programs, I was appalled at the unfairness of it. It was one-sided. Mr. Reagan may be wrong about cutting more student loans. He may be wrong about trying to cut more food stamps. My hunch is that he probably is. We shouldn't do that. But when you have a program, or constant program, in which no other side is presented, that's unfair. There is another side.
What do you mean no other side is presented? You cannot look at television any day of this week that you don't see Ronald Reagan, or Mies, or Deaver, or somebody else, or Donald Regan, or David Stockman. They've been all over the landscape trying to sell Reaganomics, and to bring some guy on who just got laid off and claim that this is a distortion of the truth is ridiculous. What do they want, a monopoly of the networks?
When you discuss public policy by a duly elected president or a senator or anything else, Carl, it seems to me you are beholden to present at least the two sides of the question by the experts that come on, by the testimony.
That's the point that Carl's making, that they do get that done.
Look, you see, you talk about, is it news that some guy out in South Succotash has been laid off his job? No, if it were one guy in South Succotash. But since last July, we've had 2 million of these people out in the South Succotashes of America lose their jobs. Because of these people, $50–60 billion added to the national deficit. By jingoes, that's news.
Sure, this has been reported ad infinitum, Carl.
Oh, ad infinitum, my eye.
The question surely is whether television in particular is an instrument suited to and at home with economic news in general. The camera is, I think, an inherently superficial news-gathering instrument and has particular trouble with economic news because you cannot take a picture of the law of supply and demand, for example. You cannot take a picture of the money supply. Therefore, in order to make vivid and concrete economic events, we translate them into discrete, particular, vivid, accurate social events that nevertheless give the viewer, I think, an inadequate understanding of a policy that's trying to be pursued.
The president says it presents a distortion. You agree, apparently.
Well, distortion's not the right word. The question is this a suitable instrument, this report that's given, accurate though it is, moving though it is?
I hate to respond by saying you do the best that you can. As you say, you can't, what's...
Martin, what I'm really
you have to reduce it to some human fact.
What I'm really trying to say is that it seems to me we'd miss the point if we get into yet another argument about the political biases of the reporter and miss the extent to which the economics and technology of the journalism business shape what gets on the air.
All right,
Well, but the political bias of the reporters is pretty important in this. You pick up the New York Times or the Washington Post, and on any given day, in an economic story, you will find they may be quoting 9 economists who are unfavorable to the president, and one, perhaps, at the bottom of the story, who has a kind word to say.
That's about the ratio right now.
But then I don't have any trust in any of these economists. They're all a bunch of swamis. But there are swamis on my side as well as swamis on the other side. Why can't they have some of my
I
swamis?
listened to Milton Friedman on TV ad infinitum yesterday morning. But the simple fact is, I agree with George to this extent. You get a cheese line out there, and you haven't had cheese lines before, and people are running all over each other because they've run out of cheese. Yes, you put that on TV, and it's dramatic, and it may make it appear that the situation is worse than it is because you weren't out in the cheese line, neither was I. But the simple fact is, we didn't have those soup kitchens before, and we didn't have the cheese lines, and TV has got to report.
Why we have to have this cheese line?
Jack, sir, you think television has the capacity to distort, and to some extent, I guess it does. What about polls? All the polls are demonstrating a growing lack of confidence throughout the country.
Well, they demonstrate a growing lack of confidence in the press. Do you believe those?
Yes, I do.
All right, let me tell
Can't have it both ways. See, this
I
is
can
one of
have
the-
it both ways. Why not?
Let me back into
They
something.
might both be justified, as a matter of fact.
You said, and I want to back into something Martin said earlier about all presidents going through this. The other day, Mr. Reagan was trying to be nice to the press in this momentary pause. And he quoted Jefferson's famous line about, were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. That was Jefferson in 1787. By sheer coincidence, I happen to have looked up a few other things that Mr. Jefferson had to say. Among other things, by 1801, he was saying, the abuses of the freedom of the press have been carried to a length never before known or borne by any civilized nation.
He was president then.
And by 1807, this is 20 years later, by 1807 he was saying, nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. The man who never looks into a newspaper is better informed than he who reads them.
Jack, distortion and exaggeration is the nature of the beast, really.
All
You
presidents
know,
go through
President
that.
Lincoln was represented as an ape, you know. No one was more vilified than he was.
All presidents.
Doesn't make it right,
Yeah.
Del Martin. But let me give you just 2 examples that I've seen recently. On the time, those days that I was in the Middle West, the big issue was about college loans, cutting them back. Martin, I must have heard 6 college presidents from the area, other commentators, in which not one single voice of the rationale behind cutting back the loans was given. It was all the disastrous dimensions of them, how it would affect them, how terrible it was, how awful it was. There is a rationale about college loans which started at a few $1 million and have grown to billions and billions that they have to be restrained. It was never said.
$10 billion for these programs.
It was never stated on the commentary. I would take the El Salvadorian coverage also.
Right.
All right,
No,
gentlemen,
we've
be
altered that.
patient, and we will continue the discussion in a minute. George, our colleague Hugh SIDEY feels that the administration point of view is not being adequately presented. Would you agree?
Well, I think it's not being adequately presented outside Washington where it has ample forum. But part of the problem is, Martin, that the administration's heart isn't into it and they're not really geared up to make these arguments because of the way they campaigned in 1980 when they repeatedly said that this wasn't going to happen. We were going to cut taxes and so stimulate economic activity that a gusher to revenues would ensue, and we wouldn't have to cut the budget. So no one really planned for this kind of argument. The ground wasn't prepared in the 1980 campaign for sacrifices. Had it been, and had in 1981 the administration not been quite so tone deaf and said these are necessary but they're going to hurt the way Mrs. Thatcher did, then I think that they'd be having fewer problems today.
Yeah. Carl, on the administration point of view and its critics' point of view, the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, is understood to have said that he regarded the president as really frozen in concrete on this position and refusing to raise taxes and refusing to cut the defense budget. Do you think that he reflects a Democratic point of view there?
Oh, I think probably more than a Democratic point of view. He lost a lot of labor support, and he still seems to think that somehow he can resurrect it and hold to his position. But I think the New York Times, CBS poll, the Washington Post, ABC polls, they all show a decline in support for the president out there among people who voted for him. And I think he's going to have to change when he faces this reality.
The economy picks up, that'll all be changed one
Yeah, that's true, Jack. If it does, and we all hope it does. But the decline goes to the point that this poll indicates that the president is lower in the public estimate at this point in his administration than Carter was at this point in his administration.
Who cares?
Well, I just
I'll tell you.
On the basis of an
I'm saying you should care or not.
You can't run this, but you can't run the government on the basis of an executive of one party and a Congress of another, and there are Republican senators looking at much more detailed polls than those that now see the possibility of the Republicans actually losing control of the Senate, particularly in any state where there's a minority population of more than 10%.
George, don't you think the political pressures are going to force him really to step back quite a way and compromise?
No, I don't, and I'll tell you why. I think presidents generally get the budgets they want. I think he can enforce minimal cuts, only minimal cuts on defense. I don't think he'll budge on Social Security, which means nothing will be done on entitlements. I think he'll preserve his tax cut, and I think that means you will have a deficit approaching $160 billion.
Martin, may I just disagree?
You think that'll do him in politically?
No, not
Martin,
necessarily.
I just disagree with George, if I may, on that.
Go ahead.
I think George maybe he's right about the state of Reagan's mind, but I think we are in such a problem at this point in these next 6 to 8 weeks that if indeed he does not make some compromises and there is not that fragment of good news, that we are going to have such bad news that either he will be a non-president, he will lose his power, or he will be forced to.
I thought that's what George was saying.
Well, let me use the number again.
Crisis here.
What Representative Jones, who's extremely responsible Democrat, is saying is that pre-policy, that is before spending cuts and before revenue increases, the current budget now generates $160 billion.
George, I just don't think...
Let me disagree with Jack. I don't care when and whether the economy picks up. You aren't going to change the fact that 84% of Americans say don't cut Medicare. You aren't going to change the fact that a lot of families out there making $35,000 a year still feel that they are entitled to a government-subsidized loan for their kid who's about to go to college this fall. The polls now show by 2 to 1 Americans say no more cuts in the social program. And I don't think you're going to turn that around by some new numbers in the economy.
But listen, this week, once more, we have a standoff in effect between the President of the United States and the Premier of the Soviet Union, Brezhnev, on this whole question of nuclear arms freeze. Indication that Mr. Reagan takes the position that the kind of a freeze that Brezhnev has proposed would be so disadvantageous to us as to jeopardize our security. And Mr. Brezhnev makes a rather extraordinary statement that he wants to bring into being a situation in which there would be, the United States would be in a position of analogous jeopardy, as he puts it, to that which the Soviet Union is faced with by our weapons. And the implication seems to be that he has in mind intermediate missiles which could actually threaten the United States from Cuba. But of course it could also be cruise missiles, it could be Soviet submarine missiles. But in any case, do you think that we see any prospect in this kind of atmosphere and with this sort of friction that we can go ahead with an effort at nuclear arms stabilization and control?
Well, Martin, I'm rather sad that Mr. Reagan or this administration has rejected so summarily this suggestion from Brezhnev. I agree that it's lopsided and you probably can't accept it, but it seems to me the cry from all over this world, and again, my experience in the Middle West and elsewhere in this country, that Reagan supporters, neutral people, the other side, are crying out to him to talk, to get down, to sit at the table, at least listen, see where we can go. And I think that he's wrong, and he's losing the propaganda war by this just bringing the curtain down.
We'll discuss that in a minute.
At 2:30.
George, the great viewing public missed your observation of classical dismay at what Mr. SIDEY had said about the prospect going on with these nuclear arms negotiations. You said, et tu, SIDEY.
Well,
what do you mean?
I don't know quite what SIDEY's complaining about. He wants us to talk about the Brezhnev proposal. It's not new, as you suggested at the outset. It was made first in 1979 and repeated ever since. It is the Soviets' negotiating position in Geneva, where we are talking about it right now through Paul Nitze. Let's make clear what the proposal is, if you will permit just two numbers, guys.
Only two.
All right.
Only two, yes.
Brezhnev says we like the situation where we shall have 300 intermediate range missiles, you shall have 0, and we shall be unlimited east of the Urals, where we can put mobile missiles that even not moved can hit Europe. Now that's the proposal we're supposed to rush out and talk about, and indeed we are talking about it.
Well, nobody wants that proposal accepted,
No,
George.
nobody.
Everybody recognizes, as long as Brezhnev doesn't say, refer to missiles that are behind the Urals, that it's an unfair proposal. But why can't it be negotiated?
What do you think we're doing in Geneva? This is the point. Ronald Reagan is doing everything people want, and they keep saying, why don't you do it?
Well, the negotiations have just been suspended, but anyway, Dr. George F. Strangelove over here misses the whole point of this thing, and my brother SIDEY got the whole point of it. We're not talking about missiles, we're talking about propaganda. In the propaganda war, we are now losing it. Mr. Brezhnev just won around in the propaganda war.
How?
By this proposal for a freeze, it was accepted all over the world as an example of great
Who accepted
communist
it?
statesmanship. Well, read the world press on it. They think it's
Our
great.
allies,
Well,
even our allies, and I stress, even our allies recognized it as a tired, shop
George,
one.
you don't turn it
So it's
down.
phony.
You
So it's
don't
phony,
turn
but
it down like that.
if you're engaged in a propaganda war,
Yeah.
you don't reject it
You
out of hand.
co-opt it. You move in, you co-opt
And
it.
you get a
take
better
it over.
proposal.
You
I
say
think
that's
Brezhnev
let's
has
talk.
provided an opportunity that we can exploit positively and constructively on our side.
Right. Let me
Pick him up and say, look, you said this, let's carry you a step further.
All right,
President-
let me get a lick in here.
try.
The
Save us.
propaganda is important, but there are a lot of people in this world and in this administration who believe that propaganda doesn't matter. The only thing that
And they're
counts
wrong.
is how many weapons you've got. But
They're
the
wrong.
simple fact is, the Russians have been moving with every kind of shrewdness you can imagine to make Western Europe more nervous every day, to make them believe that we have got a wild administration in this country. And when you jump out too fast to dismiss something like this as propaganda,
My God, we all
all you
agree.
do is say to these
Except
people,
George.
yeah, they're a bunch of crazy people. Now, we all know that it's lopsided and we aren't going to accept it. I was glad for that reason to see Weinberger say, this summer, we're going to go into these sessions. And this is the kind of talk we ought to have.
May I just quote an old hand, the old fox Mel Laird, who'd been around this town a long time from the Congress and Secretary of Defense, and he had a great rule, and it was that when anything like this was proposed, before you reject it, look about the possibilities of going in and taking it over, of saying that's a great idea, then moving along with it, bringing something positive out of it. Turn any problem like this into a positive thing for you.
The president has a proposal on the table. He unveiled it in November. It's called the zero option. He beat Brezhnev to the punch. Why are...
Forget it, George.
Forget it. Why forget it?
Forget
You
it.
know,
Forget it.
George, it's always
Go
a
on,
question. It's always a question of substance and perception. Now, in substance, let's give you the point. But if in terms of national perception, wait a minute.
All right.
In terms of national perception, if the other point of view prevails that concerns you and that concerns Jack and concerns Carl and if you like concerns me, if the perception exists, it does, and one must deal with it. It's the only point we're
George
trying
is
to
talking
make.
about the president's speech to the National Press Club back in mid-November. And it was a fine speech, and I applauded it at the time. That was where he got off of this program called START. But it stopped after we started.
No, it
All
didn't.
it
Now, look,
went to
this is
Geneva,
the
and nothing has been heard
this is the
about since.
classic American asymmetry. We put something on the table, the Soviet Union sits there, and the Kilpatricks of the world say it's not working, let's move toward the Soviet Union. No wonder we wind up
Let's
with
get something going with our START. We're not going anywhere with START.
Well, let me say this. There's something else that bothers the people out there and many of the people of the world, and that is that we're caught in this notion where anytime somebody talks about a freeze or going in the opposite direction with these gruesome weapons, we say, oh no, they've got 300 and we've got 0, so we can't do anything until we've spent $1.75 or $2.25 trillion. And then they say, oh, no, you put them in Europe, so we can't do anything till we put something in Cuba. There's got to be an end to
And they
this
say it in the
madness.
Kremlin as well as here.
I know,
That's
it
the
just
whole
goes
thing.
back and forth.
There is one difference, and that is that we had a virtual freeze throughout the 1970s when we didn't deploy an SLBM, when we MIRVed a few but did
Talking
not
about the
deploy
US.
any
Russia
ICBMs.
did not.
Yes. We had a unilateral freeze, didn't drive the Soviet Union to moderation by the power of our good example.
George, that's the next to the last word. I want to say this. Republican Senator Larry Pressler of South Dakota has requested a clarification of two observations made on this program last week when the ABSCAM investigation was discussed. And one remark was the senator should not have met with potential fundraisers off Capitol Hill. And the senator notes that a law at that time prohibited meeting or soliciting funds on federal property, and he sought to be in compliance. The second remark was that when the senator attended a meeting off Capitol Hill with the alleged fundraisers who later were implicated in the ABSCAM investigation, he didn't report this and that he should have. Senator Pressler notes that subsequently the Senate Ethics Committee investigated this meeting and held that the circumstances were such that the senator had no obligation to make any report of this incident. Well, we regret that some assertions made here last week did not deal with all of these facts. That's the last word.
Wealth and beauty become the backdrop for spine-tingling adventure and star-struck